Now that week 6 is in the books, let's take a look at a handful of players that I'm looking to trade for in my fantasy football league. Starting first with Titans running back Tony Pollard, who has separated himself as the clear RB1 in this Titans backfield. So far this year, minus week 3, where Tennessee was almost immediately thrown into a negative game script against Green Bay, Pollard has seen 19 or more touches in all 4 of his other games played, has broken 85 or more total yards in all 4 games, and has scored in 3 of them. All of this is off the back of a really healthy 16 plus carries per game, plus another 3 to 5 receptions per game, and we have ourselves a legitimate bell cow running back in Tony Pollard. Now, I'm sure some of this could be attributed to Tyjae Spears being in and out of the lineup this year with injuries, and there may be some truth to that, but Spears is currently dealing with a hamstring injury that he suffered on Sunday, and the current verbiage around him is being labeled as week to week, and if you watched my video last week, you know how terrified I am of hamstring injuries. And I even said I wouldn't be shocked if Nico Collins landed on IR with his hamstring injury, which actually did unfortunately happen. And prior to that, he was also being labeled as week to week. So let's just say best case scenario, Tyjae Spears misses a couple of weeks. He doesn't land on IR, but he's out, say, 2 to 3 weeks. Well, Pollard is going to be even more of a bell cow during those weeks, and he gets a Buffalo Bills defense that's been torched by running backs all year, including the return of Breece Hall on Monday night, then a really tough matchup against Detroit, although they did give up 3 touchdowns to Kenneth Walker, but then right back at it against a bad Patriots run defense that is currently bottom 5 against running backs in fantasy points allowed. Again, that is worst case scenario for Tony Pollard by himself, i.e. best case scenario for Tyjae Spears' injury. But let's assume worst case scenario for Tyjae Spears and he lands on the injured reserve. Well, then we get an extra couple of weeks of Tony Pollard alone in this backfield. Granted, the matchups really aren't that great, but that leads us right up to trade deadlines and the fantasy football playoffs, where Tony Pollard gets matchups against Washington, Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis again, and then Jacksonville for the second time. Every single one of those teams are either below average to very bad against the run, especially his semifinal and championship matchups against the Colts and Jaguars. In fact, I can just about guarantee you that Tony Pollard is going to be on every single video, article, podcast, social media post as a buy now target for the fantasy playoffs before your deadlines. But you were able to snag him now in week 7 as your RB2 or even flex player that you'll ride every single week that Tyjae Spears is out and right into those juicy playoff matchups. So sell high on Najee Harris after a huge week. Pivot off of Ramondre Stevenson or Josh Jacobs or Rico Dowdle or Kareem Hunt. Maybe dangle Tyrone Tracy or Ray Davis off big weeks to buy a more long-term option at running back. Just go out and buy Tony Pollard now before everybody else wants to. Now, similar to Tony Pollard is a reiteration from last week in DeAndre Swift. Now, the reason that I want to reiterate him is because what I said last week is working. I said that it's a possibility that people just think that DeAndre Swift is a mediocre player taking advantage of really bad defenses. And I won't really disagree. That could be very true, but that pattern probably isn't going to end anytime soon because his schedule for the next 4 weeks is really, really good. And the Bears are starting to pick up steam offensively as well and could look even better after their bye week. And I think that's really the key here. Chicago is on bye this week, so whoever has DeAndre Swift obviously does not have a starter this week. And if they lost other running back starters like Pacheco, CMC, Jordan Mason, Jerome Ford, Rashad White, anyone like that, they could be severely desperate for starters and fantasy points this week. So if you find yourself in a position where you can spot start someone for DeAndre Swift's bye and flex a wide receiver or something, try to buy DeAndre Swift this week while he's on a bye. Use the same players that I mentioned for Tony Pollard and upgrade your RB2 spot for the next month. Just then also make sure that you trade him away before your deadline because his playoff schedule is absolutely brutal. Now moving on to the wide receiver position, I think my favorite buy right now is DK Metcalf, who is coming off a 7.8 PPR point performance on Thursday, had 7.5 points in week 5, and hasn't broken 15 fantasy points since week 3. So managers might be getting frustrated after a couple big weeks to start the year and then just kind of not really much after that. But I haven't seen anything that would make me concerned about Metcalf for the remainder of the year or to think that his big start to the year was any kind of fluke. See, over the past 3 weeks, Metcalf has seen 12, 7, and 11 targets. He did break 100 yards in week 4, but he hasn't broken 60 yards since. And if you watch his film, specifically the Thursday night game this past week against the Niners, you would see that Geno and DK have very barely missed on some huge plays or had some huge plays called back by penalties that would have drastically changed the stat lines for DK Metcalf. If you did not watch that Thursday night game or you're not active on social media, you would not know that DK Metcalf was an inch away from a touchdown at the end of the first half, doing his best Isaiah Likely impression basically, and he had another 50-yard touchdown called back by a penalty. Imagine if both of those plays actually held. Metcalf's stat line would have been 5 receptions for 102 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, or 27.2 PPR fantasy points. It would have been his 4th 100-yard games of the season, his 3rd 20-plus point fantasy week, but because he missed out on both of those opportunities, the manager who has DK might be frustrated in this boom-bust player that they apparently drafted, and that's where you need to take advantage. So how can you turn Jameson Williams into DK Metcalf? Are you able to pivot off of Michael Pittman or Josh Downs after a couple really good games with Joe Flacco? Can you upgrade from Xavier Worthy now off a bye week, or Marvin Harrison Jr., who was drafted ahead of DK Metcalf back in August? There are ways and pieces to make moves for DK Metcalf now that give you a player that I am more than comfortable starting every single week as a wide receiver 2 with weekly wide receiver 1 upside. And then lastly, I just wanted to throw out there that now might be a good time to explore buying low on a number of elite wide receivers either returning from injury themselves or their quarterbacks are returning from injury. So take a look at guys like Cooper Kupp, possibly returning this week. Also, Puka Nacua should be back at some point this month. Maybe not this week, but in a week or two. Nico Collins has 3 more weeks on IR, but when he returns, he'll be a top 5 weekly option once again. And then we also have Tyreek Hill and maybe even Jalen Waddle, who both could regain a ton of production when Tua returns, which could be as soon as week 8 next week, especially Tyreek Hill. And I'm not saying that you need to flip like Drake London or Chris Godwin for any of these guys because they are also producing extremely well. But can you flip guys like Zay Flowers or DJ Moore or Deebo Samuel, Marvin Harrison Jr., Keenan Allen off his big game, maybe Garrett Wilson or even Devontae Adams now that they might cannibalize each other in New York? Can you take advantage of Amari Cooper being traded to Buffalo and his value artificially rising from that, now being paired with Josh Allen? You have to use a big name to get another big name, but what's the biggest name that you have with the lowest ceiling or confidence level that you can flip for a higher ceiling, league-winning type of receiver who's just hurt or not very productive right now? Those are the questions and moves that you should be considering as we cross into the second half of the fantasy season and look towards actually winning a fantasy championship.